Hi. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you all for coming tonight. To those of you that are experiencing your first ever Criminal Justice Series event, welcome. My name is Raya Castronovo, for those of you that don't know me, and I am the Vice President of Alpha Phi Sigma, which is our Criminal Justice Honor Society here at the university. In 2017, we started an event series that includes panel discussions, speaker events, and other forms of dialogue on issues related to criminology, criminal justice, and the law. To those of you who are returning for more, welcome back. I appreciate your continued support. I would like to take a minute to thank the students, faculty, and staff in the School of Public Affairs for their support, and as always, our Dean of the School of Public Affairs, Paul Teskey, for his help. I'd also like to thank our Marketing Director, Tula, as well as Dee Dee Flynn, who's seated in the back there. She's our Public Relations and Events Coordinator, and those two helped us facilitate this event. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge our Student Criminal Justice Honor Society, Alpha Phi Sigma, for their role in putting together these events. This evening's panel discussion focuses on impaired driving. I will be moderating the panel. I will ask the questions and I will keep time. The last 20 minutes of this this evening's event is reserved for audience questions, so feel free to ask our panelists questions during that time and we'll make sure that you're heard, okay? One last thing, I would just like to take a moment to remember and acknowledge those who have been victims of impaired driving as well as their families. It is my hope that these discussions or discussions like the ones that we're having tonight will leave us all better informed and educated on how we can approach and prevent impaired driving. So thank you all again for coming and let's get started. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just give a brief introduction of who they are and what they do and all the amazing things about them. You want to start, Hannah?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you, Raya. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you all. My name is Hannah Huyck, and I'm a program coordinator for Mothers Against Drunk Driving here in Colorado. I have been with them in some capacity since January of last year. I started out as an intern, and then I worked my way up to make this my career. So I work in several different areas within MAD, but most of my time is spent within our court monitoring program, helping to run that efficiently, and then also working within our data unit. I am a native to Colorado, so I am recently getting into hiking and enjoying all that we have to offer here. And then I am also an alumni from SPA. I got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice, and I'm hoping to go back for my master's soon. So that's all about me.
My name is Lester Nieves. I am not a native of Colorado. I actually came to Colorado to go to law school at CU. Graduated in 1993, and I stayed here, and I'm never leaving. I've been practicing law since 1993. Before that, as I stated, I was in school, and before that, I was in the military. I was in the United States Army for 4 years. Before that, stationed, unfortunately, in Georgia. So that was my foreign country, and it is sort of. Thank you.
My name is Melissa Annis. I am a magistrate with the Denver County Court. I've been in that position since 2016. Prior to 2016, I was a defense attorney and practiced criminal defense all around the state of Colorado. I am also not a native, but I have been here since 1999. I went to law school at DU. And then I also never left and am probably never leaving, although I might go back to North Carolina in retirement, but we'll see, that's a little ways away. With Denver County Court, I have been in multiple rotations. For the longest rotation, I was in the arraignment court where I set bonds and ran several of Denver's specialty dockets, and I preside over the sobriety court, which is open to folks who have prior DUI convictions and are high risk, high need for an assessment. Yeah. What's a docket? Oh, that's a good question. A docket is a series of cases that come through the court, right? So every day I have a list of cases that I'm going to hear, and that's a docket. Good question.
All right. Thank you so much. Alrighty, so since about 2016, there's been a decrease in DUI arrests and convictions in Colorado, while impaired driving itself has been on the rise. Do you know what factors impacted that decline and how it has continued to go down for so many years? And similarly, do you know what factors have impacted the rise in impaired driving and why the trends are going in opposite directions?
Let me take that question. In Colorado, there's two types of impaired driving offenses. That would be DUI, the standard DUI, driving under the influence, and driving while ability impaired, DWAI. DWAI would be like a lesser of the DUI. DUI is more serious, DWAI is less serious. If your blood level alcohol, strictly talking about alcohol now, is 0.08 or more, you get a DUI. If it's between 0.05 and 0.08, then you get a DWAI. It is not that there has been less arrests or convictions. It's that when cases end up in court, the lawyers plea bargain the case. They talk to the district attorneys about it, trying to find a resolution short of a trial. A trial takes a lot of time and effort and cost for everybody, for the government and for the defendant. So what you end up doing is you end up working at what we call a deal. And the deal usually on a DUI is that you end up pleading guilty to a DWAI. The sentences, if it's a first offense, are a little bit different. The big difference really is that if you have a DUI, your license will be suspended, for 9 months on a first one, because it's a 12-point offense. A DWAI is an 8-point offense, which would not trigger a suspension of your driver's license. So you get charged with a DUI or a DWAI, and you end up working the case out, and the person ends up pleading to a DWAI. That's why the DWAI cases are on the rise. It's just a result of the plea bargaining.
So I think what I would add to that, and thank you for sharing that, I do think that we are seeing a decrease with the trend of DUIs. And I think some of the factors with that are that we have limitation on resources as well as staffing. So across the board, there's a shortage of officers. It's becoming harder to keep them. And there's a lot of different various reasons why that is, both social as well as financial reasons. So that could be a whole nother panel where we could spend the whole night talking about that. But whatever the reasons are, there is a shortage on officers. And then when we funnel that down into DUI enforcement, it becomes even smaller. And so we don't have the man and woman power to dedicate to DUI enforcement in the way that we really need to. On top of that, we don't have a universal reporting system for these DUI reports, and these can take hours for an officer to complete. And so if you have an officer who doesn't have a lot of experience in these types of arrests and dealing with DUIs, then it's going to take them even longer compared to someone who has that experience. And so that's also a factor, because with the limited staffing, and then we have we're taking these officers off the street to still do important work with these reports, but they're not able to be out on the roads and making these stops and getting impaired drivers off of the roads. And then another factor is there was the issue when COVID began with the blood versus breath tests, because judges were throwing these cases out if defendants weren't getting the option to do blood or breath tests. And so that's another factor that comes into play. As far as why we're seeing impaired driving increase, I think that it's very fascinating to look at COVID and the implications that that has had. So when COVID began, we were already in the midst of a mental health crisis, and COVID only exacerbated that. People were looking for ways to deal with the situations that they were being thrown into. And for those who had mental health issues or were dealing with substance abuse issues, they didn't really have the resources that they needed to make it through. And so we had people trying to cope and turning to different substances. And then if we also look at how the roads were at that time, there were fewer people out on the roads, but there was kind of
I would just kind of jump on to a couple of the things that Hannah said. cases being dismissed for not being given a choice of test. I mean, that's what the law requires, right? So the law requires that a person be given a breath or a blood test. And I think there are just a few exceptions if the blood test isn't available. And so, we are bound to follow the law there. That certainly might account for some of the trends, but, you do have to follow the law. I also, in looking at the question, I think I don't know what supports that there's an increase in impaired driving if it's not through arresting and convictions. So I was kind of thinking that it's a bit anecdotal to say that impaired driving has increased, but arrest and convictions are down. I don't know where that increase is coming from, what supports that. I mean, I think we can assume that people drive impaired and aren't arrested, but without having data to support that, that's a little anecdotal. Certainly, Hannah is correct that, especially with COVID, law enforcement, definitely in Denver, and I'm certain all around the state, have experienced a significant decrease in the numbers, right? And so you have to focus on, or at least there's been a shift in enforcement to more serious or major crime. My understanding is that the positions are being filled and that enforcement is trending upward again. And just in my personal experience day to day, it does seem that arrests are trending back up for impaired driving from where they were during COVID.
And if I can add something to the blood and breath, the law says that when you get stopped and you're under suspicion of driving impaired, the police officer has to give you a choice. So it's your choice between breath test and blood test. However, if breath test is not available for whatever reason, then blood test comes into play. So a police officer who doesn't have the availability of a machine or for COVID reasons can't do the machine could have easily said, you know what, that is not available, it's the blood test, and you will do the blood test. But that's not what was happening. Pretty much what was happening is that people would say, I want a breath test, and the police officer would go like, end of story, that's a refusal, and it's over.
I think it's a very multifaceted issue that's occurring. So thank you for covering a lot of those parts. You sort of started to dive into it, Lester, but I'm just curious what steps are followed when someone is suspected of impaired driving and how the use of discretion impacts these steps.
Discretion always comes into play when there's any kind of investigation. But DUIs, what you usually see is that the officer is watching traffic or driving in traffic, sees somebody who's driving erratically or committing some sort of offense and stops them for investigation. The other way it happens is that somebody calls it in, because there is a program where any driver can call the police, it's called a ready report, and report somebody who they believe is driving impaired. They'll give the traffic plate on where they're at. The police will be dispatched if there's enough law enforcement around to do that, and then they will follow him. The police will be following, and the police is looking to see how he's driving. Now, the reality is that all of us have gone speeding at one time or another, or maybe not use the signal light, but the police officer needs something to stop him. Once he thinks he has something, whatever that might be, he will stop you and he'll approach you. He will start, the investigation started on the driving, but it really takes speed once he talks to you, because when he comes in and talks to you, he's watching how you react. When he asks you for a driver's license, proof of insurance and registration, he's looking to see how easily you find those. Now, for those people who are nervous and start like, oh, where did I do that? And I raised my hand on that one. That's evidence to the police officer of probably impairment. He's also looking at your eyes. He's looking at smelling your breath. If he thinks that there is enough there for further investigation, discretion comes into play, because at this time he might say, oh, no, the person looks fine. It was just a little traffic issue, but they're reacting normally. And then he'll say, have a great day, or give you a citation for speeding or for whatever it was. Now, if he believes that there is further investigation needed, he'll ask you to step out of the car. You have to step out of the car. And then he will ask you voluntarily if you want to do some roadside maneuvers. The ones we usually see is the walk and turn. They'll tell you to walk 9 steps, turn, come back, in the line. They usually tell you, another one is what is called the horizontal gaze nystagmus. And what they do is they have their pen and they tell you without moving your head, look at that. And they're looking for some things, how you track that pen. And then another one would be when they tell you stand, lift one leg, count to whatever number. And there's other tests, but those are the usual ones that are used. You can refuse to do this, but if you refuse to do this, the police officer will interpret that as you're under the influence and you don't want to take the test.
Uncooperative. Yeah, that you're being
uncooperative and you don't want to take the test. If you do them and he doesn't believe that you did them properly, then he'll proceed. If he thinks you did fine, then he can say, okay, you're fine, go on your way. If he thinks you did not, that's when the tests come in and he'll say, I'm arresting you for suspicion of DUI. You have a choice to take a voluntary, a breath or blood test. They are voluntary. However, refusal, the law says shall comply, but you can refuse, but you will lose your license irrespective of what happens on the case. So if you refuse, you fight the case, you go to trial, you win the case, your license is still suspended for that refusal. So there is a cost associated with you saying, I'm not going to take the chemical test. Say you do take, and by the way, they will charge you anyway, because there are two types of DUIs. There's, remember, the DUI and the DWAI. But on the DUI world, there's two types. There's the DUI per se. That means you took the test and the blood level was higher than 0.08. And then there is just the standard DUI in which the officer says, his ability was impacted, he couldn't drive properly because some substance, okay? So they can charge you with a DUI even without a test. So what happens is if you choose to take the test, you'll go in and you'll either do a blood test, and it has to be somebody whose business is to take blood. It's not a police officer doing this. Or you'll take a breath test. If you do the blood test, the result doesn't come in for a while. And part of the problem with COVID too and labs is that the laboratories are like absolutely overwhelmed. So when you do a blood test, the result won't come in for weeks, sometimes months. Yeah, when you do the breath test, that's immediate. You go in there, you blow, here's the result. When you do the blood test, they'll still charge you, but then you'll have to go to court, and then it becomes an issue of, are we going to wait for the blood test to come back? Or are we going to try to resolve it, or are we just going to set it for trial? It becomes really complicated. DUI cases are really, really complicated. People think, oh, it's a misdemeanor, but it's more complicated than many felonies. So that's how the process works.
And just to piggyback on what Lester said, because a lot of people don't know this, the court doesn't have any power over your privilege to drive. So that is how you can refuse. You can refuse to take the test, lose your license for a year, and be found not guilty in court. Because your privilege to drive is an administrative agency, the Department of Motor Vehicles. All the court does is report whatever the outcome of your case is to DMV, but those are unrelated. I have people all the time who say, wait, are you gonna take my driver's license, or what's gonna happen to my driver's license? And I have to say that is a separate issue. And so people like to ask, well, what should I do? And it's impossible to say. As Lester said, there are consequences if you refuse. It might ultimately benefit you in court to refuse, but is it worth losing your license for a year? So that it's very complicated and very tricky, but just to make sure that people understand that those are two different things. The only other thing that I was thinking about in the process is the PBT, that the officer can use a preliminary breath test. It's called a PBT. And so and that's in the officer's discretion. So if the officer is maybe unsure on the fence, you smell like alcohol, but you've done okay on the test, or you are responding in an appropriate way, the officer can use a portable breath test. I couldn't think of the word. But they are not admissible in court. So that's kind of an interesting facet to this, is that the officer can use it to make a determination about whether or not to arrest you. But if you were to go to trial, that test is not reliable enough to be used in court.
I do have a question though. When you decide to take a blood test, I'm assuming you're incarcerated when you take it.
Well, yes, you're in custody. You've been arrested. Yes.
Yeah, you've been arrested.
So how long are you in custody taking the blood test?
Yeah, go ahead.
So here's what happens. You say, I want to take a blood test. So what the officer will do is he'll go to the fire station because there's a medic there, who will do it. He'll take you to the hospital, whatever's closest, because there's a time limit on the testing, 2-hour time limits that they need to do this testing from the stop to the test, or they'll take you to the station and they'll have a medic there, who'll take the blood test. Now, you are in custody at the time, but once you take the test, the police officer can take you to detox, and drop you off there, or he can leave you, put you in the jail, or he can take you to jail, to the jail, but not release you and say, hey, have somebody come and pick you up, at some point. So, there's options, but when you're doing the test, yes, you are under arrest.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting, that is a huge discretionary decision for the officer, is what to do with you when you're done. And in all the years that I've practiced and been on the bench, I could not tell you at all why the officers take the course of action that they take or how they make that decision, but they have the discretion to place you in custody and in jail, where you can then post the bond, which in Colorado, it's or I shouldn't say in Colorado, in Denver, it's $1,500 cash, property, or surety. So you can post the bond, have someone post it for you, or you can wait and see me the next day. And then you are typically given a PR bond, but you would have to spend the night in jail, or why they take someone to detox, or they have the discretion to call a family member and have you released. And I don't know any rhyme or reason as to how the officers decide what they're going to do there.
Just going to segue for a second here. I know that sometimes thanks, Ted, for that question. Sometimes, as we all know, the defendant becomes the main person in a case. And so I'm curious, when someone is arrested for a DUI or there's an accident that's the result of impaired driving that results in property damage, personal injury, or death, how are victims included in the offender's criminal justice processing?
I'll start with that one. So I think something important to keep in mind is that we don't refer to these as accidents. It is always a crash, because when someone decides to drink or use some sort of other substance and then they get behind the wheel, that's always a choice. So that is something at MAD that we always try to get across. As far as how we try to make victims a part of the process is, at MAD, victims are at the heart of everything we do. We want to make sure that they're always remembered, that they have a voice, that their loved ones have a voice. And one way that we make that happen is that we have amazing victim advocates that are there to be their voice, to make sure that they're not forgotten, and to support them in whatever way they need. And so they can be there from the beginning of the case, when there is an active case, to 20 years down the line. And they are always there to support our victims. In addition to that, I think another way that we make sure that victims are part of the process is we have victim impact panels. And although that is not necessarily with the specific victim of that specific crash, it allows victims to get their voices across and to make sure that what happened to them matters. And it also allows the offender who got the DUI to see what the potential consequences are and see that if they make that choice again, it could be a much worse outcome.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, all districts, counties, district attorneys' offices have a victims advocate unit. They really are really good. And I say that because I've represented victims in cases too. I do defense work, but I also represent victims here and there. It is fantastic. They are. We'll add this so everybody knows, when there is a crash accident, the case changes. If it's just property damage, then it will remain, a DUI or a DWAI, unless the damage of the property goes pretty high. I think it's $2,000.
I think it's even higher than
It's
that
even higher.
now, yeah.
But if the value of the property goes to a certain point higher, then you'll get the DUI, but you'll also be charged with criminal mischief, which is a felony depending on the value. But if you hurt somebody, okay, if you're intoxicated and you hurt somebody, and I don't mean you hit somebody, I mean you can hit somebody or your friend in the car gets hurt, okay? The dynamic completely changes because now instead of the DUI, you are looking at vehicular manslaughter or homicide if that person dies, or vehicular assault. Both of those cases are felonies. The vehicular, homicide is a felony, and you're looking at up to 12 years in prison, state penitentiary, not county jail, which is where you go for misdemeanors, and it could go up to double that. So if you hurt somebody, and this is really important because a lot of times, I've had people get in the car and I ask, well, what were you driving? And he's like, it's not even my car, it's her car, but she was so intoxicated that I decided to drive. Then they get into an accident and her friend, gets hurt, and then they get charged. And it's like, why am I being charged since it was her car and I drove because she was more intoxicated? And I say, it's irrelevant what the relationship is. The fact is that you made a bad choice to get in a car, when you were intoxicated and you drove. And the same thing applies if you hit a pedestrian. If that person dies, we're talking about vehicular homicide. If they get hurt, then you're looking at vehicular assault, which is also a felony. And again, the penalties completely change and the whole formula for what happens to you as the defendant changes.
And I would just add from the court's perspective, I mean, the victim's voice is just critical. Victims have the right, whether it is property damage or someone was injured, you have the right to be at every stage of the proceeding. And the court will always allow the victim that space to give their perspective because, I think that certainly when someone is injured, we view it as more serious and the law views it as more serious, but property damage, if your parked car is totaled, I mean, that can just wreak havoc on someone. And so I know in my bench in Denver, I mean, the victim's voice is loud and it should be, and it's allowed to be. And in my treatment court, if there's significant damage, and certainly if someone is injured, that case is not eligible for our treatment court and should be treated differently. And the law allows that if there's a conviction or a guilty plea, the law requires that a restitution hearing be held within 91 days. So if your parked car, which is, we see that a lot, right? The impaired driver hits the illegally parked car, and now that person, has to pay their $500 or $1,000 deductible. If the defendant says, well, I'm not responsible for that, then you have a hearing within 91 days. And the purpose of the hearing is to make sure that the victim is made whole, at least financially. Obviously, when we get to that vehicular homicide and assault level, it's a very different purpose, right? Because you can't make a victim whole who has lost a family member. And I, Lester, you can speak to this because I haven't, I am on the bench in Denver County Court. I haven't practiced in years. But when I did practice, I had vehicular homicide cases, and I can't remember a vehicular homicide case where the defendant did not get 12 years. And I don't know what it's like out there now, but back when I was actively practicing, almost always the person went to prison.
Yeah, and I actually had a vehicular homicide case about, I want to say like about 4 years ago. And that's exactly what my client got, 12 years. And just so you know about victims, the Constitution of Colorado has a Victims' Rights Act. So the law will protect the victim.
Thank you so much. I'd like to segue back to the position of the offender or the defendant, and just ask you if you have any follow-up on what the options are for the prosecutor and the person being charged, when a DUI or DWI or any form of impaired driving has occurred, whether that's deferred prosecution or diversion, if that's a possibility, and, whether first-time offenders receive opportunities that repeat offenders might not, those types of things.
Well, I'll start, and then Lester, I think, can jump in. You know, everything is very statute driven in Colorado, and so there really isn't a lot of discretion on the part of the prosecutor. I can tell you that in Denver, they do not do deferred prosecutions or diversion on DUI first, and that has been a long-standing policy. I know some jurisdictions do, but in Denver, there are no deferreds on DUIs and no diversion. But in order for the prosecutor to make an offer that is not a DUI or a DWAI, they have to make a record that they are unable to prove a prima facie case. So they have to explain to the court why it's not a DUI or a DWAI. So it is pretty limited. Now, all sorts of things happen. You know, there was a lab in Colorado that you probably heard about in the news, you know, that got shut down. And so there are some things that happen that where then the prosecutor has to, you know, they don't want the case just to go away, right? So then they have to make an offer of reckless driving because it's seen as better than nothing, right? But in the most broad sense, legally, prosecutors are very limited in what they can do on impaired driving cases. And the same is true for sentencing. It's all statute driven. And so I don't have discretion on sentencing. If it's a third DUI, it is a minimum mandatory 60 days in the Denver County Jail, and it has to be flat time. I will say the law recently changed. Oh, flat time means thank you. So just in the, you get no credit, right? So you don't get good time, right? So in Denver, you do 18 days on 30, but not on DUIs. So if it's 60 days, it is 60 days, and you do every single one of those 60 days. The law did recently change to allow a little bit of discretion to allow for in-home detention on these mandatory sentences, but it's a pretty significant record that the court has to make in order to do that. And so far, I've had one case where the DA said if the court finds appropriate to make this record and not have the person do the 60 days in jail, the people are okay with it. But then I have to make the record about why I'm doing it, which you have to put a lot of thought into that, right? Because we're talking the third time a person has been through with this. So, and then on a second in a lifetime, it is a minimum mandatory, which means I don't have discretion, 10 days. And then I think that's it. And then it gets more serious, obviously, if they're felonies. So, so that's the court's perspective, right? On what are the options, is that they are relatively limited.
Just kind of off of that, I'm curious, what about like waived fines, or how do you go about determining which fines to suspend or waive?
Again, that is all driven by statute. So you can't suspend victim compensation. You know, it's all broken down. So we actually like have the computer, right? And it shows you all the fines and costs. And typically, you know, unless there is something really significant, I don't do that. I impose the fines and costs, and people are typically on probation from 1 to 2 years. And all of that is driven by law, and you just don't have a lot of discretion on it. So if you have a prior, then you usually are placed on 24 months of probation. And during that time, you can make payments on the fines and costs. But the statute is very specific about what can and can't be waived.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, I'll add this. The defendant doesn't have any options here. Okay, none. All the options come from the district attorney. While they are limited, they do have options. Denver doesn't do deferred judgment. Does everybody know what a deferred judgment is? No. Nobody knows. Well,
yes. Just kidding. Only because of Mad. Thanks, Mad.
Raise your hand there. A deferred judgment is when you plead guilty to a crime, whatever that might be. You get placed on probation. If you are successful with everything that you're asked to do at the end of that time period, they will withdraw that plea of guilty, dismiss the case, and you end up with a clean record. Okay, that's what a deferred is versus any other case where you plead guilty, you put on probation, and at the end of the day, you have a conviction for whatever it is. Now, Denver doesn't do that, but other counties do. Diversion is a little bit different. Diversion is where they don't even charge you. You know, they just put you on a program, probation again, some sort of probation. And if you are successful, then they don't file a case against you. I've never seen any alcohol cases. I don't know if you've seen it where diversion is even in the cards. Now, what ends up happening is, you know, again, you know, you talk to a district attorney, you usually work out a deal, because the reality is that you cannot go to trial. Nobody can go to trial. No court system can go to trial on every single case. I think the plea bargaining rate is probably 90%.
Yeah, probably higher.
Like
I would say it's higher.
Yeah, it's probably higher because you just can't. But the defendant will take pretty much what the district attorney offers or go to trial on the case. Those are his two options. Many times, you know, most cases get plea bargain. As I said, you know, in Denver, they don't do the first, they do it in other counties. Now, sometimes the DA will have a problem. They have a bad case. It happens. She mentioned the lab. There was a lab issue where they weren't doing tests. They were lying about the results of the test, and all of that happened. And so the district attorney is caught in a bind, and he's like, well, I can dismiss the case or get something. So they'll do something, probably non-alcohol. And what they usually do is called reckless driving. It's an 8-point offense. But what is colloquially called is wet reckless, which means that you plead guilty to the reckless driving, but the consequences, what they're asking you to do on probation is the same thing that they would ask you to do if it was a DUI or a DWAI.
And I mean, those are reserved for really when the DA believe, I mean, they have to say they can't prove their case, right? So it's pretty limited. I mean, I think at least in Colorado and in my experience, DUIs and DWAIs, and the prosecutor definitely has, I don't want to say the upper hand, but you know,
they have the upper hand.
They do. I mean, because the officers have a very set procedure, and this science has been, you know, put to the test time and time again. And so, I mean, I think I read recently that the conviction rate on DWAIs is like 97.6% or something, right? It's really high. Now, whether that be you go to trial and you're found guilty or you plead, it's a very high conviction rate. There was a second part to your question about first-time offenders, which I thought was interesting.
The second part was, well, the first part was first-time offenders receiving opportunities that repeat offenders do not. So I do think that you covered most of that, but if you have a follow-up, please feel free.
I mean, that's just common sense. You know, if it's the first time you've been in trouble, you're going to be treated better than if you're a repeat, you know, offender. And that is true across the board on anything, except when when the district attorney has a problem with the case, and that happens.
And, you know, that is, again, it's statute driven in Colorado. So on a first DUI, it's 24 hours of community service, right? On a second or third, it's 48 hours. The fines are the mandatory fines. I actually don't know off the top of my head for a first, but on a second or third, it's $600, right? So, and it's less on a, I know because I do the treatment court, so I have to impose the minimum mandatory $600. But so obviously first-time offenders get, you know, it's less harsh, I guess, or, you know, less significant in the amount of probation time, right? It's 12 months, and you can apply for early termination when you've completed all of the requirements. For second and third time offenders, we always start at 24 months. And then again, you can try to get off of probation earlier, but your state mandated alcohol and education therapy goes up considerably. And the hours are much longer, and it takes a long time to complete those state mandated classes on a second or third. So.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes left in the panel portion before we move on to questions. So I would just like to follow up with asking what impaired driving
important to address the education and awareness pieces to end impaired driving. And so I like to think of it like when we don't have these campaigns around us, it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. We don't hear that there's still impaired driving as an issue. And so we might think that it's getting better, or we just don't think about it at all. And so I think these campaigns really put it back in our minds. So when we're driving down the highway and we see these signs on the road telling us to drive sober or get pulled over, it just reminds us that, oh, this is at least still an issue, even if we don't know exactly like how bad or good it's getting. And so I personally really like seeing these campaigns come about. And then although it's not a campaign, I really am proud of our court monitoring program within MAD, because it still helps with that social awareness, both in the courts as well as with our analysts and our monitors who go out there and they spread the information that they're learning. I get a little choked up about it because I'm really proud of what we're doing. And I think it's very effective at addressing those pieces.
I have nothing to add to that. Pretty much what I would say this, I think, the best thing you can do is awareness, because what usually happens, and we see this in a lot of DUIs, is that people just don't know. They go out there, they have 2 or 3 drinks, and getting to a 0.05, say you weigh like about 140 pounds, that's 2 drinks, pretty much, you're there. I mean, it is amazing how fast, you can get to an illegal level. But I'll add one more thing that has nothing to do with the campaign thing. We're talking here about alcohol this, alcohol that. DUI is not driving under the influence of alcohol. It's driving under the influence. Alcohol, illegal drugs,
or a combination.
Okay, combination or medication. Ambien comes to mind. So if you took your Ambien and you decided to get in your car and you get stopped and you do a blood test and they see that Ambien, they're going to charge you with a DUI. So let's not forget that a lot of the DUI cases we see are not alcohol, it's a combination. And we don't have time for it today, but marijuana now is becoming a growing issue in terms of the DUI, and it's super complicated. But, that medication bottle you have that says drowsiness, dizzy, that means don't take it if you're going to drive, because if they stop you or if you get into an accident, and the law requires that if there's an accident and you become unconscious, they're going to do a blood test on you. So, I've had people come to me and say, oh, it was my Ambien or something else. And I'm like, yep, this DUI is not driving under the influence, driving under the influence, alcohol, drugs, or a combination. So don't forget that.
I also think programs like this, where you guys are hearing and then you tell a friend, and, even just thinking about the fines and costs alone. I mean, I actually can tell you it's about $2,400 or something, right? Just in fines and costs. That doesn't include if you're on monitored sobriety and you have to pay for that. It doesn't include the classes. And then I just, think about Lyft and Uber. And I'm like, even if it's $80, even if it's like peak Saturday night, I've been down here and I'm like $80, but man, $80.
Cheaper than me.
Right. Way cheaper than Lester, I can assure you. Way cheaper than coming in to see me, so even just on a most like basic level. And okay, if you get a parking ticket because you had to leave your car, it's $25. Right? The parking ticket is $25. Come down to the Denver parking magistrates and tell them, I had been drinking, I took an Uber, they'll reduce the fine for you, right? Especially if you haven't had a parking ticket. So, I mean, it almost sounds silly, but I think it's just worth kind of putting out there. Tell a friend, right? That it really just isn't worth it. And I always say, rule of thumb, if you've had 1 drink, don't drive. I mean, maybe that's too conservative, but I don't think so, because you don't want to have to spend the night in jail and all the things. And I mean, forget if you hurt somebody, right, or your friend or yourself, and So, I think that these types of programs are great to spread the word. And I also was thinking about the heat is on, but do they call it? So if you're not sober, get pulled over now?
So NHTSA has drive sober.
Oh, drive sober right now. Yeah. But also the heat is on. Who knows the heat is on? Always. At the holidays, it's always, all the time. Yeah, the heat is on, and they up the enforcement. But I mean, like, nobody's hiding it. I mean, sobriety checkpoints, they're a thing, right? I mean, it's intended to deter people. Like, we're going to have a sobriety checkpoint here, on this night. And it's intended to help people make better choices. So those were a couple other ones that came to mind.
I think it's important to get that point across about the effects of if they do drive impaired and they hurt someone, because who wants to have to live with that for the rest of their life? I mean, I can't imagine. And I think just being exposed to so many of the kind of victim stories and all the people that have been injured or worse from impaired driving, like I know that just affects me more to not want to ever.
Right. And you always think it's not going to happen to me, but I'm telling you, in my practice, and Lester could tell you this too, I have seen really wonderful human beings go to prison for 12 years because they didn't think. I mean, I'm not here to lecture, but I just think, just having that experience that think it's not going to be you, but it absolutely could be you, because I've seen you and me. And, I've seen people who think, oh, it couldn't be me, and then it's them.
Yeah, and by the way, on the 12 years of prison for a vehicular homicide, that's for each person. Okay, so if 2 people are deceased, now you're looking at 2 counts of up to 12 years in prison. The judge can say, I'm giving you 24. I want to add one more thing for educational purposes. A 4th DUI becomes a felony in Colorado. Okay, so now you're looking at up to 6 years in prison. And this is regardless of you hurting anybody or having an accident. If it's a 4th, and that means a DUI anywhere in the United States or territories.
And anytime, lifetime.
Yeah, at any time, lifetime. Puerto Rico, Guam, it doesn't matter. If this is a 4th, it's a felony, okay? And you're looking at up to 6 years in prison and a fine of up to $500,000. So things get serious in a hurry.
Well, thank you so much for those answers and for all the wisdom that you've shared tonight. I'd like to take this time to open up the floor as well as the Zoom chat. We do have some members of the community joining us online tonight. So I will let Dee Dee take it from here. Do you want to start with Zoom, Dee Dee?
Wonderful. We can start with Zoom. So one of our Zoom questions that we got is a 3-parter. Oh. So, but you kind of touched on the first 2. So it was, as a judge, how do you decide what sentence to impose? As a DA, how do you decide what sentence to offer as a plea deal? But then since you kind of touched on that already, they ask, when might a judge decide to impose more than the minimum mandatory sentence that's in the statutes?
Yep, and I do that. I listen to arguments from the district attorney and the defense attorney, and sometimes more than the minimum mandatory is appropriate. It's aggravating factors, right? So the amount of damage, I see cases where someone has hit 2 parked cars and then went down the road and hit 3 more parked cars. Is there an assault involved, right? That's pretty common. If somebody is extremely impaired, then they assault the paramedic or they try to assault the police officer, which actually then kind of gets to felony land. But, there are times when that's appropriate. And so those are how those decisions are made. How aggravating are the facts and what's the mitigation, right? So you have to kind of weigh both of that. If there's a victim, then obviously you give weight to the victim as well.
Thank you so much. We'll go right here.
Since you were talking about aggravating circumstances, I'm also just wondering about like extenuating circumstances. So say that somebody chose to drive impaired because they were in a situation where they felt or like they either perceived or actually were in danger, and driving was their only option to leave that situation. Is there any like legal?
There is a defense. It's called duress or choice of evils. I would let Lester tell you how successful that is, but go ahead.
You know what? It's called choice of evils. In other words, I have 2 bad choices. Which one am I going to pick? It doesn't save you from the charge, right? And it doesn't save you, from going to court and everything else. It's mitigation for sentencing, clearly, and it's mitigation for the plea bargaining, when you're talking to a district attorney, but it still doesn't save you from it, unfortunately.
And I think, those things happen, especially, domestic violence situations, right? Road rage. And I've been presented with that, and it's certainly mitigation. I always would just add, most people always have their cell phone. And if you don't, then go to the police station, right? Because then that officer maybe has some discretion in how to handle what's going on with you. If you, felt like you were, especially like a domestic violence type situation, right? Then drive to the police station. And most people don't, you know, I don't know that that's going to save you from getting charged, but it happens, but it's probably not gonna.
Yeah, medical emergencies do come into play, you know, on people driving, but it's discretionary. I mean, they can just say, you know what, I'm sorry.
Sorry that happened.
You know, sorry that happened.
Tell the judge.
Yeah, tell the
yeah,
judge.
tell the DA, right? And then that's when that piece comes in,
Yeah.
right? That, you know, then you hire a Lester and then they go talk to the DA and maybe the DA can, you know, do something given the circumstances.
Thank you.
You got a hand over here.
Everywhere.
So I was just wondering, you mentioned earlier that it's up to the cop's discretion to decide whether or not to keep someone in jail overnight or whether to release them to the loved ones or whatever. So how does that affect your sentencing decision as a judge?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
Yeah, because I am really aware that I'm unaware of any rhyme or reason to why the officer makes the decision that they make. So it doesn't play into sentencing.
We'll do another quick Zoom question. Can you still get a DUI for drinking or smoking in your car while it's parked in front of your house?
Lester, go ahead.
The short answer is no. It is not illegal to drink and drive. It's illegal to be intoxicated and drive. If you are, you know, I have seen cases where domestic cases where they get into a fight and it's always the guy goes into the car to drink, the police come, you know, but they never get charged with a DUI because you have to actually be driving. Here's the warning though. Say you've been driving and you pull over and you turn the car off. It is DUI in Colorado if you're in a car in a driver's seat with the key in the ignition, even if the car is turned off. That is DUI, and we have all seen those cases. Yes. So, you know, if that's what you're gonna do, keep your key in your pocket,
right?
You know,
right.
Or get on the back seat. Right. You know,
don't be above the legal limit and then take a nap in your car with the car running so you stay warm, because that is DUI, and we have seen that a lot. I mean, that's very common. So no and yes. Don't do it.
Oh, hang on one second. Can we use a mic so the people on Zoom can hear?
That has, I know what he's going to ask. He's going to ask about
with the new technology. We don't have to put any key in the ignition. It just senses the near proximity.
Right. So don't be impaired and get into your car that's going to start. I mean, there are elements that the district attorney has to prove. And one of the elements is that you were driving a motor vehicle, but driving it's broad. Right, Lester?
Yeah, I mean, I would say because it is true that the law is always behind technology. It's never in front. So if that's what you have, don't sit on the driver's seat. Get on the passenger, on the back seat, then you won't have an issue.
I'd say don't get in the car. Just stay away from your car.
Yeah, easy to say, you know, it's minus 20. You know?
Well, get warm in the Lyft or the Uber.
True that.
Thanks for being here. So you mentioned throughout this panel just a couple of the impacts of the pandemic on DUI enforcement. And I guess one thing I just wanted to touch on was the backlog of cases, just because with the court delays. And I was just wondering if you think that we're back to normal processing times with that, and if there are any other impacts that you see, like maybe the lack of availability of treatment services or anything, other things you can mention.
Yeah, you know, I was curious because of the first question that was asked about the decline. And so I just looked on the colorado.gov. They have the whole dashboard. And because I was curious, what was the impact of COVID on arrest? And, you know, per the colorado.gov website, it went from about 21,000 DUI arrests in 2019 to 16,000 in 2020, and they didn't have 2021. So, I mean, I think that I don't believe there is still a backlog. And, you know, we kept things running during COVID. I mean, the courts, there were some delays. And because there was such a decline in enforcement during COVID, it helped in not creating too much, at least for Denver, a backlog.
It created a backlog. And it is true that the courts were still in business, and a lot of the business was being done, via video, not trials. Okay. The problem was getting jurors, because obviously nobody was coming in, and the authority said you can't go in and be, in a big group. But that is going down. But there's always going to be a backlog in courts because there's so few of them and there's so many cases. That's why the plea bargaining system, works, because if it wasn't there, the system would collapse. You just couldn't take it. Remember, when you get charged with a crime, once you plead not guilty, you have a right to have a trial within 6 months. Okay, and it sounds like a long time. It is not. Time flies, and a lot of times, I had a marijuana case had nothing to do with driving in Colorado Springs. I was supposed to be in trial 2 weeks ago. We showed up, and the judge looked at us and said, "Let me see. I got 9 trials today," and we're like, "Where are we?" "You're number 9." Because it's marijuana, it's not that important. So they had like assaults, sex assaults, and those kind of cases take priority, as they should, but that happens, and that will happen even if COVID is not around.
Yeah, and I would just add, from the court monitoring side of things, it always seemed like it was running really smoothly because everything was up on WebEx. And as you guys were saying about the trials, I remember hearing a couple of judges talking about that it's really hard to do like the audio for the people in court and the people who are watching through WebEx. So I can only imagine like how trying that part would be, but it seemed like overall it was very fluid with how they were bringing in defendants and getting the cases going.
And just if any of you, she asked about treatment providers, if anyone is on the fence, if you're in school and you're like, I'm not sure what I want to do, please be a treatment provider, because that's pre-COVID. I mean, Colorado, we are like 30, maybe Tuesday, I don't know if you know, but we are like 38th ranked or something in being able to provide services for the people who need them. Colorado really needs treatment providers, and it has not gotten better post-COVID, right? Because people made career choices and changes and decisions. And we have 2 committed treatment providers in my treatment court, and they work nonstop. I mean, they're just not enough treatment providers. So
job security.
Right.
Job security here.
If you want to be a treatment provider, I can tell you all the places that are hiring.
I'm going to cut back to Dee Dee.
Yes. So we have a current police officer on Zoom who wants to know, how can he, as a current police officer, better assist you in upholding your DUI cases?
I think it's just important to pull over anyone that they think might be impaired, and it's better to get them off the street even if they don't end up getting charged. That's what I've heard from some other officers who are very supportive of what we do. It's better to get them off of the roads, and then it's better to get them off the roads rather than send someone out who might be impaired and then they hurt someone.
I would add, and I love that question, and I love the wanting to do better and be better. I would say know the law, right? To make sure that the law requires a choice of test, and that if the breath test isn't available, then what is step 1, 2, and 3 after that, and to make sure that you're following it and not trying to hurry things along and cut corners, which is I don't love that term, but that's exactly what it is, right? Make sure that if you're going to pull somebody over, that you're in it, and you're going to see it through. And I think that's how things are done, and cases don't go to trial and are pled, which gets that conviction.
I'll add this for everybody, but especially for the police officer. I was a public defender for 11 years when I started, and I've been in private practice for like 15 or 16. And I actually became a friend with this officer who worked for West Metro Drug Task Force. And one day we're talking, and he was telling me, oh yeah, some of the detectives hate you guys, and I'm like, I'm just doing my job. And he's like, well, what can I do so you don't grill me? And I'm like, be honest, be honest, because if I find something that you did that was wrong, I'm gonna go after that, period. If you're honest in everything you do, and I look at the report, I'm pretty much stuck. I'm like, I have nothing, But if you cut corners, if you were less than honest, believe me, I will find it and I'll make a case out of it.
Thank you. I think we have a couple more questions.
Just some clarification on the choice between breath and test. Is breath like a literal breath test, or is it a swab? Like what's to prevent someone that has been smoking to choose the breath test because they're afraid it's going to show in their blood?
Okay, first of all, swabs are not swabs are for DNA. You know, if somebody's doing a swab, it's a DNA test. A breath test is exactly that. You blow into a machine. Now, the breath test only tests for alcohol, okay? Whereas the blood test tests for whatever the officer asked that the blood be tested, because when they submit that, they'll say, I want you to test for A, B, and C, you know, and whatever the officer asks, that's what will be tested at the lab. They won't do any extra, I assure you that, but they will test for whatever you ask.
And I think that's why it's important to have drug recognition experts out
Yes.
there, because they know the signs for someone who's under the influence of alcohol versus other types of substances. And so that's why we need more people out there in that field, and we don't have enough at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sorry, what's that?
Would they not get a choice if it's something other than alcohol that they're suspicious for?
Sorry,
Like
I'm
if
going to
they-
repeat that for the Zoom.
Yeah, thank you.
So if the question is, if it's not for alcohol, do they still get a choice in type of test?
If the officer has probable cause to believe that it's not alcohol, that is something else, he can then ask for the blood test. And, you know, that's what it is.
All tests are full screen panels. Blood test is a full screen. They all go to the Department of Public Safety. So it's not what the officer checks, they check the whole panel.
Well, you know, the reason I mentioned that is because I've had some tests that come back and it says, you know, we check for cannabinoids, alcohol, you know, cocaine, and then that's it.
Yep, fair enough, but they do a full screen, cost the same. The statute for tests doesn't direct the peace officer to do anything other than to tell a person they're required to take a test.
Right.
Yep.
It's the responsibility of the person to know that. You have to tell a person they're under arrest and they're required to take a test. If there's more questioning, you can tell them it could be a breath test or a blood test. If the officer feels that the impairment is coming from something other than alcohol, then he can direct the blood test.
Yep. Thank you. I think we have time for about one more question. I know Ted had one.
Okay, we have a good wrap up one from Zoom as well. So could we do two?
I'm going to say,
No, that's all right.
yeah,
That's
no,
right.
yes. And I'm going to keep them short and sweet. Thanks. I don't believe you, Ted, because I know you, but please go ahead and try.
Okay, cool. I don't think we touched on this subject, but the amount of deaths, have they trended up or down? And I have another question for that.
That's a Hannah question.
Yeah, that is the Hannah
Yeah,
question.
so they've trended up. So the thing is that we've had less people out on the roads, but the fatalities have increased.
Okay, and second, you're from three very different perspectives. What would you do if you had the power to kind of like alleviate these issues, make them kind of stop or trend them lower? If you had to implement any system, solution, et cetera?
If I had the power to do so, I would have Lyfts and Ubers be free to everyone, right? And be safe, right? And be available and not be $80 and an hour and a half wait. And it's not Uber and Lyft's fault, right? But we do have a way to not have people, because when you're impaired, right, your inhibitions are lowered and you make decisions that you otherwise wouldn't make, right? Sitting here right now, you say, well, I would never get in the car after I'd had 5 drinks, right? Till you do, right? Because it's December and it's cold outside and you are hungry and you're tired, or we see this so much, you're home and then you're starving, but you don't want to pay $38 for DoorDash to bring you Taco Bell and it's just down the street, right? So if I had the power because you're not going to stop people from drinking, right? And going out, and that's not good for our social and economics and all of that. But that's what I would do. I would make it free, available, easy, safe, right? So that you're not afraid to get into the Uber or Lyft because you're by yourself, and just make that the norm, right? That's what I would do.
You know, it's interesting. That's an interesting question. And I'll say this. One of the things that they make you do when you get a DUI, okay, when your license is suspended, is they make you put a little machine, you know, in your car, okay? So you have to blow, and if the machine registers hot, it won't turn on. There's a conversation going on now about whether that is gonna be put in all cars at some time in the future. Obviously, it's a big issue because we're talking civil liberties, but that's a conversation that people are beginning to have, you know, because of alcohol.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to cut to the Zoom.
Okay,
Sorry.
all right.
That actually, the second part of your question was very similar to the Zoom
Perfect.
question,
Take
but
it away,
I will
Hannah.
I will just partial. They did say like, how can we spread the message to alert about the risks and outcomes to the people? And then maybe to expand on that question, a question for you all, since there are so many questions and we weren't able to get to all of them, like how do you recommend that people go about asking these questions in the future when we're not in this room?
Sounds like a Hannah question.
Yeah,
like
take it
that's
away,
all
Hannah.
Well, I was just going to add to Ted, is that your name? Okay, so I was just going to add to your question that we have the technology and we are going to get it in place. It might take up to 30 years for us to really get things in place the way that we need them to, but we have the technology, and I believe it's Volkswagen, is that correct? That the technology is already in their cars, I believe. Yes.
And so it's already been passed, right? The whole act, it's already been passed federally. And so I can't remember what year, it's either 2027 or 2028, that all new cars have to have this equipment installed.
Yeah, so it's just a matter of time before we make it happen. And it's not like the clunky interlock devices. It's going to be like in the driver's seat, and it's going to, I believe it's off of the breath and just kind of what's going on here. So it's not that like if someone in the passenger seat is impaired, then it's not going to let your car start. But we do have the technology. We're going to get it in place one day. And I think that's going to be really impactful for ending impaired driving. I think as far as getting the message out, campaigns are going to be a really great way to spread that awareness.
Yeah, education.
Yeah, education.
Education, education.
And in terms of getting more information, you are more than welcome to contact me and continue to ask questions. I can pass them along. I can connect you to any of these individuals, as well as Matt, who has a pool of resources to answer your questions, as I'm sure do our law and court systems. So I'm just more familiar with the first one, but we'll find a way. So if you have questions, please reach out to me. I can give you my email and we can definitely get you some answers. So unfortunately, that concludes today's panel. I just want to thank you all again so much. It means a lot to me and to the university that you're all here today. And this is our last panel of the semester, unfortunately, but we do have 2 more next semester. So keep an eye out and we will let you know what exciting topics we have coming up. Thank you so much and have a good night and get home safe.